Hey, what's up everybody? Commander Radix here, bringing you another episode of History and Lore, my series where we look into the history and the mythology and the lore of this world. So I've been recently reading a little bit of Before the Dawn, Recovering the Lost History of Our Ancestors by Nicholas Wade. It gets into a lot of the sort of prehistory of mankind, a lot of the evolutionary history, linguistic history, and especially genetic history, and how we can sort of combine these different fields of science to put a picture together of the prehistoric world before writing was existent. And while I was reading the book, I found something interesting, something I didn't expect. And I thought, you know what, we need a history and lore video out on the channel, so let's go ahead and turn it into a little short history and lore video. And it's on a topic that I haven't really covered that much. A country I haven't really covered that much. Today, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to talk about the genetic origin of the Icelanders. Iceland is an interesting country. It's on the very fringe of the European world, on the fringe of the Nordic world, right? It's out there in the sea by Greenland, and of course they speak Icelandic, which is a Germanic, very old language. And people have been living in Iceland for well over 1,000 years at this point. And yet at the same time they've also been relatively isolated, as we'll see later. And because of that, it makes their genetics of the Icelanders, the Icelandic people, very interesting, as we will see. Now, popularly, when we consider Icelanders, Icelandic people, we think, oh, they're one of the Nordic countries, right? So they must be, a Norse Germanic people. And that's true to an extent. But there is a component, an interesting component in their genetics that you might not expect. And we're going to talk about that today. But first, we need to go back to the Dark Ages. The Roman Empire has collapsed. You have a lot of different ethnic groups migrating and invading different territories across Europe. And one of these famous groups are the Vikings, Norse people who are getting on their boats and raiding the coast of Western Europe. And eventually they're going to get into different places like Russia, Sicily, Constantinople, all over the place. One place that they particularly go deep into and invade is northern England, right? And even today, there is a distinct sort of Danish genetic signal in the people of North England. I myself, a lot of my ancestry comes from North England from that time period. And indeed, I do have, according to Ancestry.com at least, a significant amount of Norwegian and Swedish ancestry. Now, the Danes are mostly active in places like York and Norfolk. The Norwegians like to operate a little bit more to the north, including the Orkney Islands. These are islands up to the north of Scotland that were populated by Scots people. But in the 9th century, the Norwegians conquered the Orkney Islands. They sort of use it as their home base for further raiding in Western Europe. And even there's a language there, or there was a language there called Norn, which is basically a variant, an Orkney variant of the Old Norse language that was spoken there until about the 18th century. And even today, the Orcadians have a significant amount of Norwegian ancestry. Now, the Orkney Islands, again, were used for further invasions, further attacks. They're going to be able to go across Scotland and then down into the waterways between Ireland and Britain. And they're going to establish their own Viking settlements in Ireland and Western Britain. Upon creating these settlements, they're going to actually intermarry with the local people. So that means, especially, you're having Norse men, Viking men, and local women, usually Celtic. So, for example, the Irish in Ireland, Scots Gaelic in Western Scotland, but also some Anglo-Saxon people, like the Northern English, right? Now, in the year 870, at this point, the Vikings are going to sail north, a few days sail north from Scotland, and they are going to discover the island that we call today Iceland. Now, Iceland wasn't completely uninhabited. It was habited by some Irish, Orthodox Catholic hermits, but upon the arrival of the Vikings, the Irish sort of leave the area. So the Vikings effectively discover this huge, relatively speaking, compared to the Orkney Islands, this big island land that has no people living in it, but vast farmland. So we're going to see a large amount of Norse people from that Norse ecosystem in the North Sea go into Iceland up until about the year 930. At that point, There's been a lot of deforestation on Iceland. A lot of the farmland has already been claimed. There aren't really any real benefits to moving to Iceland at that point in time. So around 930 is when the immigration to Iceland stops. And effectively, immigration to Iceland is going to essentially be closed up until modern times, not necessarily because of legal reasons, but because there's no reason to go there. And this brings us back to that comment I made at the beginning of the video about how the Icelanders have been genetically isolated for a long time. And because of the long, isolated characteristics of the Icelandic genome, they are actually useful to find genetic roots of things like cancer, heart disease, asthma, and schizophrenia. Now, we talked a lot about these Vikings coming into Iceland, but there's another group of people we should be talking about here. If we look at Icelandic records from like the 12th and 13th centuries, things like the Book of Settlements and the Book of Icelanders, these are general censuses, if we could think of it like that, of Iceland. And they reveal that basically, while the Vikings might have directed the migration to Iceland, they weren't the only ones who participated in it. For one, these are Vikings coming from, and I'm using Viking and Norse interchangeably, I know it's not the same thing, but bear with me. But they're coming from places like the Orkney Islands, like Ireland, like the western side of Britain. That means they are bringing their British and Celtic families with them as they're leaving their settlements. Which means that many women moving to Iceland were not themselves Norse. Based on surnames in the Book of Settlements, we see that 5% of the male founders of Iceland were genetically from the British Isles, from the Orkney Islands, from Great Britain, from Ireland. And around 17% of the women were from these places as well. Something that we also can't forget about is that the Vikings took a lot of slaves on their raids. They would raid territories and take mostly women as slaves. And so there are a lot of slaves going into Iceland that are going to be genetically Celtic, or what we could call Celtic, and Anglo-Saxon to a degree. Based on more recent DNA findings, we can determine that around 20 to 25% of the men in Iceland at this early stage were indeed of some sort of Celtic origin. Now, whether or not that is true from the beginning or up until now, it's hard to really understand the evolution of Icelandic genetics, mostly because there have been a lot of genetic bottleneck incidents. A lot of events have happened that sort of narrowed down the amount of ancestors an Icelandic person can have. From 1402 to 1404, the Black Death killed 45% of Iceland. In 1708, a smallpox epidemic killed 35% of Iceland. A volcano eruption which caused a famine in 1784 and 1785 led to a 20% decline in the Icelandic population. But all that aside, there is a sort of mixed Norse-Celtic identity to the Icelanders. Wade actually points out in his book that this sort of dual heritage is what the Icelanders used to sort of differentiate themselves from their Danish overlords in the 19th and 20th centuries, which they were not happy to be a part of. So to sum up this video about the sort of ethnogenesis of the Icelanders, we have a lot of Norse ancestry indeed, but also something that might be surprising, something we might not expect, is a large amount of Celtic and even Anglo-Saxon DNA admixture in the Icelandic people. Which is just another small little fact about Iceland that continues to sort of differentiate themselves from the rest of the Scandinavian Norse ecosystem, as it were. But that's going to wrap up this video. I hope you enjoyed. I hope you learned something. Thank you guys so much for watching. Consider subscribing to the channel to check out more videos on this channel. I make a lot of history videos, mythology videos, things like that. We've made several videos at this point on the sort of ethnic or the genetic origins of the Japanese. Maybe check those videos out. If you're into the more Germanic stuff, we've talked about old Germanic gods like Twisto, for example, who is spoken about in Tacitus's Germania. But anyway, yeah, make sure you subscribe to the channel if you have not yet. Follow me on social media. The links are all in the description, and have a great day, ladies and gentlemen.